Welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight. I'm Judith Krober, and today Troy McLachlan is back. You might recall that we had a wonderful talk about the crimes of the Saturn Death Cult, and today we will go a little bit into the cosmology of this entire subject. So, Troy, welcome back.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me back.
Okay, so when I was reading about the purple dawn of creation, I was wondering, because it really stands out, why purple? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, last time we spoke, we spoke of the power of symbols, used as weapons of control by this predatory occult culture that has infiltrated most human institutions, governments, religions, that sort of thing. But part of the language of symbols is also the language of color. And colors play a very, very important part in establishing symbols. Jay Widener once talked about, the idea that if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a symbol is worth 1,000 pictures. And, and what we've discussed is how symbols trigger subconscious archetypes, these main archetypes being, the patriarchal Godhead Saturn archetype, the mother nurturing Medusa turned killer Venus archetype, the scarred hero of Mars, the doomsday archetype, which is, in my book, Saturn Death Cult, is the most important thing to get your head around. This fear of yet another repeat of a massive planetary catastrophe that took place in ancient times. And of course, chief amongst the symbols associated with the Saturn archetype is, this eye of providence, the all-seeing eye, something that we see, most prominently in use today on the world's reserve currency, the US dollar. There it is at the top of a pyramid. Pyramid is again a part of that Saturnian archetype. But the color purple is very much associated with Saturn. It's become the royal color. And purple is a mixture of red and blue. And when you look at ancient mythology, they refer to a period before the golden age of Saturn, when the god Saturn ruled this time of paradise, and humans came to understand how to calculate the passage of time. Weights and measures became effective. It was just, a wonderful time to be alive, according to this mythology. Prior to that, there was this primordial existence, and Hesiod speaks of it. A number of don't quite come to mind at the moment. The other people, there was, I think, Ovid, the Roman poet. He also spoke of this time prior to the Golden Age. And if you remember, according to these writers, according to these ancient people who curated the whole idea of mythology, there was a golden age, followed by a silver age, followed by a bronze or heroic age, followed by an iron age. And these are the epochs that men have gone through, due to the capriciousness of the gods and the way that the gods have behaved over that time. But prior to all that time was this purple dawn, this semi-nocturnal world of permanent duskiness, where time didn't exist, and humans basically existed in this situation as literally like the animals of the planet. The weather was uniform. There were no seasons. There was no access to the greater cosmos. You couldn't see past the sky to the stars. There was nothing that could give you any sense of time passing. If you went to sleep and woke up, you wouldn't have known if you'd been asleep for 5 minutes or 5 days. And within all this, there is a a lot of the, particularly the Mesoamerican mythologies and so on, they talk about this time period as being a time when there was this very dull glow from what would be recognized as the north. It was a stationary source of this purple light. And in most of these mythologies, that's recognized as the god Saturn in his sleeping state. Before he burst forth, brought light into the earth and the beginning of time. So yes, the primordial time period, of which there's no way to calculate how far back it went. It just simply was the stasis of the world and the human experience prior to the arrival of the god Saturn, in terms of bursting forth with his light and bringing an entirely new environment to the earth. So this primordial existence, I argue in terms of Saturn theory, which says that, as we discussed before, that the planet Saturn was originally seen to be the original sun of the earth. In other words, the earth had been a satellite of Saturn before its capture by the sun. And this particular period when Earth and Saturn existed outside of the solar system, and so on, seems to have, it would have gone back untold years, covered the epoch of the dinosaurs even further back, and so on. We have no idea how long it existed. However, it started to change. I estimate between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. Things started to change on the planet. The last great ice age started to happen. And the reason that change started to happen, even though it was still this encapsulated purple duskiness that life existed in, the reason it started to change was at that point in time, the Saturn system of planets began to electrically sense the sun and its solar system, and began to accelerate towards it, on a path that would ultimately end up in a very catastrophic capture of Saturn and the separating of Earth from Saturn, well within the timeframes of the human experience.
Mm-hmm. So you already touched on that when you said purple became the royal color.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say the so-called royal, because personally, I don't believe in royalty. There's no such thing as royalty. That's all made up to control others. So would you say there is a direct link between that color of that time before Saturn, and that they turned it into their color, which was reserved for a long time for so-called royalty and the priesthoods?
Not as a result of the purple dawn. That was the primordial world. What happened was that when Saturn began the capture process, when the sun began the capture process of Saturn, Saturn underwent a huge change at Novid, and it ejected lots of materials, but it became, probably 30, 40 times brighter than it had been during the Purple Dawn era. Now, if we surmise, and this is where it comes back to, what kind of skies did the ancients actually see, and what can we look at in our understanding of astronomy, cosmology, things like that? What celestial body would produce the effects that mythology is telling us that the ancients saw in the skies above them? And the primary thing about a brown dwarf star, if it undergoes electrical stress and so on, it will heat up, it will eject stuff from its body, and it will undergo a tremendous amount of a change in terms of its color. So a brown dwarf star is a misnomer. It's actually a celestial body that is magenta in color, which is a form of red, sort of a deep crimson-like red. However, when that body becomes electrically stressed according to electric universe principles, which is what we're arguing happened during this capture process, the output of energy heats up. It becomes a lot hotter. And in the spectrum, in the light spectrum, blue light is the hottest color. It seems, we usually associate blue with cold and red with hot. But in anybody who's a photographer who does lighting understands that the brightest and warmest light, which is daylight, is predominantly in the blue spectrum. You might have, you guys probably science classes in Germany, the Bunsen burner, you put you look at the Bunsen burner in your classroom and somebody's hair always catches fire because they go too close. They don't see the blue tip of the flame because it's daylight around them. It's matching the sun's light. And so they don't see it. Well, when a body like like a brown dwarf heats up like that, it will go blue and then back to red. And it's that fluctuation between blue and red that creates that purple glow. It's every brown dwarf puts out this ultraviolet infrared spectrum that is, how can I say, enhanced by electrical stress when these things happen. And so there is a purple glow about this. Now, we discussed last time, or we can go into more detail as we go into the actual capture process if we get that far with regards to these bodies and how that happens. But during that process, the protective cocoon that in electric universe we call a plasma sheath, or what is known in electrical engineering as a Langmuir sheath, and that was dissipated and became transparent. So all of that purple glow during the purple dawn era, which came from a body that was putting out ultraviolet and infrared, which is wonderful for plant life. They love that. That's the light spectrum that they absolutely love. So you can imagine the Earth was lush during these times. And once that protective cocoon of that plasma bubble dissipated, the effect was that Saturn, rather than illuminating the Earth in uniform reflected purple light, now glowed as a sort of a purple object with, that fluctuated with like a magenta type disk and a blue disk, over time. And it existed in that celestial north, according to the ancients, where the pole star is today. And you had this, to this day, the Chinese refer to the celestial north as the purple pole. All right, that's where the color purple emanated from. And so this body became associated because it brought about this golden age. It brought light. It became the king. Well, not the king. It became the sort of the father god, the creator god, because later on Zeus or Jupiter would become the king planet, and so along those lines. But in this case, Saturn, by glowing out and as a sun, shed this wonderful, beneficial purple light over the northern hemisphere, during this golden age, and during that time. Another color becomes very important because the water that was ejected during the nova process as a result of the first fluctuation in electrical stress upon capture, because brown dwarf stars are copious water carriers. Though all that water particles, the vast majority of it, settled into orbit around the brown dwarf, which would become Saturn, and formed rings, the famous rings of Saturn. And because that plasma bubble had dissipated at this time, the rays of the now encroaching sun, which is in the more yellow-green, red and blue, but predominantly a green-yellow source spectrum, hit those water particles and created a golden crescent around the face of Saturn, which was fluctuating between these purples and these reds. And so basically that's where you get this idea that the creator God is associated, and people who are associated as his authority on Earth, which is the whole basis of what the Saturn Death Cult reaches for in terms of its supposed justification and authority. But the colors of red, blue, gold become entrenched in the idea that, that's the king planet, the god planet, and that's their colors. So metals like gold, colors like anything that had purple and red, and you get a famous thing through the ancient world, what they call Tyrion Purple, which was the single most expensive fabric throughout the ancient age, that one could buy. It was made by crushing snails from somewhere in the Mediterranean and creating a dye. You dyed wool of that color, and if you could afford that, that marked you as somebody of extreme status. And the fact is its color mimicked what this purple glow is. Now, all cultures, Judith, talk about this purple horizon, this purple glow, and it's always associated with the North. The American tribes in the North American continent, and even as far as the South American continent, they have the same idea that that the North is associated with the color purple, a purple haze, and it was considered to be a good thing, something that would ultimately lead to people wanting to get back to those days when we had that very beneficial purple glow. And I'll sort of end on that one because what that actually also tells us is why the North Pole and the Arctic Sea supported things like mammoths, huge populations of creatures in what is now a frozen waste. Somehow it seems at one point the land surrounding the Arctic Sea were incredibly lush, and probably one of the biggest anomalies is that the Arctic Ocean, which is almost cut off from all the other oceans, is so full of biological material. It's biologically the muckiest ocean on the planet. There's more stuff floating in that ocean than all the other oceans combined. And it makes no sense if the world has always been cold at its poles and warm at its equators. Why is the Arctic Sea, simply the most, biologically infused part of the planet? And it would seem because at one point that was the best place on the planet to be in terms of that warming glow by what the ancient says was this original sun that sat at the celestial north before it was kicked out of its place and ended up where it is today on the outer edges of the solar system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have any ideas when and how and why Saturn turned dim again?
Yes. Well, when you nova, it's a little bit. One of the great things about the electric universe model, all right, is that you can extrapolate up from small laboratory experiments, and you can see how that would work at the grand cosmological level of up to galactic levels. And if you consider that a nova is really a short circuiting, it's like a light bulb blowing out. You know what happens when especially the old fashioned bulbs, the incandescent bulbs that had before everybody went to these energy bulbs and so on. When you blew a bulb, there was that flash. The whole thing just burst out. And if you saw a bulb go like that, you would also see that there was a residual glow, even though it was no longer receiving electrical power. The element was so hot that it would glow for up to 30 seconds after the bulb had blown. Now, effectively, this is what happens at a galactic level and in terms of sort of at a planetary level, and essentially when Saturn was captured by the Earth's much more powerful electrical field, it short-circuited. It was like a power surge into a light bulb. And that's what caused this great bursting forth of light onto the Earth. And then Saturn glowed for a period of time, for a long period of time, because it wasn't a little light bulb. It was,
Yeah.
this giant sort of thing, or whatever. And one of the things that we find in mythology is that the Golden Age, yes, the god Saturn becomes sick and ill as time goes on, as the Golden Age approaches what would become a doomsday event. And that doomsday event would ultimately see Saturn displaced from his position that had become the abode of the gods, this northern celestial area of our skies. And as the Golden Age finishes, the pressure, the electrical pressure from the sun, and even the gravitational pressure, everything that goes with it, forced Saturn to basically sever its ties from its planetary bodies, that its satellites that it had, and become this decrepit old man in terms of mythology, that is pushed out of the realm and defeated by his children. This is where the factor of Jupiter comes into the mythological equation, and he gets pushed out into the until he becomes a speck in the sky. And this has always been the anomaly. Why was, if that speck was only ever a speck in the human experience, why was that speck, once it was picked out by mythologists, say no, it had actually been our first and greatest sun? But if this is in any way true, one of the things that we should be able to find about Saturn is that it should exhibit characteristics that are star-like, residual characteristics. And this is one of the great shocks of the modern paradigm of astronomy, planetary science, and so on like that, was when they found out that Saturn actually emits more energy than it receives from the sun. And it shouldn't happen according to the accretion model. There shouldn't be more energy generated than it receives from the sun, and yet it does. And on top of that, it pumps out X-rays. It pumps out radio signals. It's a very active planet in terms of that kind of activity, which according to the mainstream idea of science, it shouldn't have. But according to Saturn theory, it's what you would expect if it had once exploded into life as literally as early as I would say 12,000 years ago. That's the date that I would put for Saturn's initial explosion, nova-like explosion at the beginning of its process of capture by the sun. So all we're seeing with Saturn, and all we're seeing with what's happening with its rings and so on, is we're seeing the residual effects. It's a dying light bulb in terms of the electric universe model, and that has that gives us our clue that Saturn was once probably very different to what we see it today. And if we are to believe the mythologists, they were right on this. I mean, after all, one of the most incredible things about mythology is that these ancients, they gave us details of these planets, Mars, Saturn, Venus, that could not be seen until the advent of the modern telescope. The rings of Saturn. And I think one of the most incredible things that, and it is one of the great, lost opportunities of the electric universe and Saturn theory, was that the ancients told us that Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, had rings. They saw it. They said that planet came along, or that god, and it stole the rings of Saturn when Saturn was knocked from its perch. So they knew that Jupiter had rings. Now, we didn't find this out, I think, until about 30 years ago. Not even our telescopes have picked that up. It took flybys by probes to find out, yes, in fact, Jupiter does have rings. Now, how did the ancients know that? How did they know that the face of the planet Mars was deeply scarred? The Valle Marinaris, which is that huge canyon, makes the Grand Canyon look like a scratch, and so on. And that can't be seen by the naked eye in the current situation. It can be just picked out with telescopes. And yet the ancients were completely aware of the fact that there was a scarring feature on the planet Mars. The list goes on with what the ancients knew about these planets. There's only two solutions, and that is that they had, if those planets have always been where they are, the ancients had telescopes, they had some form of astronomical gear that we're unaware of that they had, or those planets were close enough to observe these details with the naked eye. My bet is on the later one, because that's what they tell us. They tell us Saturn was a giant sun. They tell us that Mars and Venus came very, very close to to the surface of the Earth on multiple occasions, and and they saw details along those lines.
So these, when Mars, Venus, when they came closer, was that during the so-called Golden Age?
No. The story of Venus, according to this, according to the Saturn theory that I adhere to, which is very much along the lines of Eduardo Cardona's, ideas. Remember that Saturn theory has different proponents and so on, and different people involved in Saturn theory, marrying it up to world comparative mythology, have different ideas about how what the ancients saw can be explained and so on. I tend to follow Cardona's sort of reasoning when it comes to the in how to explain this cosmology. And one of the things that happens in that cosmology is that the electrical stressing of this brown dwarf star that would become Saturn, when it is captured, creates a rupture in its core. And that piece of the core is ejected because that piece of the core of all planets have poles. They're magnets, basically. They're a form of magnet, especially when electricity is flowing through them. And if you get two magnets of the same polarity, they will repel each other. It's the old story, it's sort of opposites attract. But if you try and force the north pole of a magnet against the north pole of another magnet, you get that resistance and so on. So a piece of magnetized core that is fractured because of the electrical stress will ultimately be flipped out under extreme heat conditions from the core of the planet under electrical stress. And if it's big enough, it will form a satellite around that object. Now, because of the nature of what was going on, and we've got to talk about the idea of a polar configuration rather than a disk orbiting configuration like our solar system is at the moment. But during that golden age period, it seems, according to what we're told, that this piece of core that was ejected, very hot, very volatile, settled in a position underneath Saturn, between Saturn and Mars. And because of the fact it was a part of the core and it was freshly fractured and it was hot and incandescent, it displayed aspects of itself that have gone down in mythology as the famous, eight-pointed star of Venus, the glowing beauty of the goddess Venus, as it would come to be known. Now, during the Golden Age, that configuration, which is the polar configuration, which has the Earth under Saturn's, and we probably need to discuss how this is possible at a later date, but take it from the mythological idea that Earth is below the south of Saturn because Saturn is in the north. Between the Earth is Mars, between the Earth and Saturn is Mars. And now you've got this extra planet, Venus, very newly birthed, that has joined Saturn and Mars in the celestial north. And they glow and they do their thing, they get settled and so on. And in the golden age, this is apart from the initial destruction of the novering of Saturn and the chaos monster of the materials that were ejected and so on, this settles into a very peaceful and beneficial period. But when Saturn starts to be pushed out electrically by the sun's power and also by the arrival of the planet Jupiter, there's a confluence with Jupiter that causes all kinds of problems. That configuration of Saturn, Venus, and Mars gets broken up. And while in the golden age, those planets would vacillate up and down, think of it like a yo-yos on a string, and come close and back and create incredible spectacles. When that gets broken up, they become independent and they start to do what is called cometing. And particularly Venus becomes a very dangerous comet in very close proximity to the Earth, as it basically, like everything at that point in time, they're all trying to find their natural orbit around the sun, because they're being broken up by the sun. And so everything is fighting for its place in the sun. And there's that period of chaos that lasts quite a number of years, probably up to 2,000 years, that sees Saturn, banished into the outer realms, but Mars and particularly Venus menace the Earth. They don't collide with it, but their close flybys create electrical storms, create all kinds of interactions that are incredibly destructive to people living on the planet. And that's why the ancient world was so obsessed with tracking comets, with tracking celestial bodies. That's why the astronomer was really the high priest of the truly ancient cultures. And it was their job to watch these objects and to see, what danger they could bring. But yeah, that happens at the breakup of the Saturn system and what I call the beginning of the Silver Age of the Earth. It's the doomsday event. There's a whole lot of other stuff involved in that, but those planets, even after the doomsday event, they're a menace. This is Venus turning into Medusa. It's the Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, turns into this evil witch comet that brings nothing but death and destruction. Saturn himself is called, is associated with the Scythe and the Grim Reaper because all of this chaos is really associated with him. He birthed Venus. Mars was part of his abode of the gods, and he let it all go to pot. And and then you've got the introduction of the planet Jupiter, who for a period of time replaces Saturn in the skies of Earth. And then eventually, I would say as late as 2000 BC, some would even put it as late as 500 BC. It's only about then that you get the configuration of planets that we see today revolving around the sun. Things seem to settle down. But boy, they were terrified of any cometary bodies. They were constantly on the lookout for planets, particularly Venus, whether or not it would break its position and fly about. Have you ever seen the Eye of Ra or the Eye of Horus of Egyptian design with the the makeup that they have, and it has the pointed thing with the frond that comes out. A lot of guys in Electric Universe who follow Saturn theory, they say that comes about that largely that's a depiction of the wanderings of Venus. The frond is the curling frond is the wanderings of Venus. The sharp pointed bit is Mars, as it vacillated up and down between Earth and so on. The eye that the makeup encircles, of course, is Saturn himself. But so it wasn't all just straightforward up and down and then broken up. When that breakup happened, all kinds of chaos. They absolutely ran amok.
So you also write about the Ganymedians. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And that was a spacefaring civilization that was looking for refuge.
That's in my book, Purple Dawn of Creation. And it's a speculative book on what might have happened. In other words, I try to explain the approach of Saturn and its planets from the perspective of the solar system before Saturn arrived. And if there had been a human-like civilization at that time, what they would have witnessed had they sent probes, had they been a spacefaring people at that time, what they would have seen, if they sent probes to look at this approaching brown dwarf and the couple of planetary bodies that it had around it. And it comes largely because I wrote a book. I was co-author with a guy called Ted Holden, of the famous Impossible Dinosaurs theory. It's a book called Cosmos and Collision. And we just asked the question, before the arrival of Saturn, what did the solar system look like? What were the native planets to the solar system? And what might that have been like? And Ted was particularly keen on finding a world that could support life, extraterrestrial life, but a world that was bright, not this dark purple dawn type world of the Earth, because really what he was looking for was the possibility of exploring the idea that humans are not originally native to Earth, but came to Earth at some point in time. And the reason he had that was, in the Purple Dawn, we are the most disadvantaged of the creatures on the planet, because we don't have the tools of measurements and such like that. We don't see well. Our sense of smell is dreadful. We're not fast. We still have our brains, but we don't have the environmental conditions that sort of allow our brains to operate in terms of creating technology during a Purple Dawn, because we can't measure time being the beginning of it all. And so he wondered, how could a creature like that exist, come into being? And the reason for that is that what we notice is that virtually 90% of the world's animal species, insect species, and so on, are perfectly adapted to a nocturnal world in which infrared ultraviolet light is the main source. We're the odd ones out. We're terrible we're in that environment. So he just wanted to see, he thought that naturally we would come into being on a planet that was bright, like our daytime is. So we looked at what the solar system might have been like before the arrival of Saturn with Earth in tow. And of course, the candidates for that are the gas giants, Uranus and Neptune, but primarily, human life can't exist on those planets. They're gas giants and such. You've got Mercury too close to the sun, but you've also got Jupiter, which is also very similar to, it could have been a brown dwarf star in its own right. So we, settled on the idea that maybe the solar system was a binary system between a brown dwarf, which would later become the planet Jupiter, and the sun, and that brown dwarf Jupiter was much closer into the sun. And around Jupiter, you've got 4 terrestrial planets, one of which is the most Earth-like object in the solar system in terms of what you need for life to exist on a terrestrial body. Has its own intrinsic magnetosphere, absolutely essential to guard against radiation, this sort of thing. It has water, an abundance of water, and so on. So, and it has the vestiges of what would have been an oxygen atmosphere. It's the only body in the solar system that also has oxygen. So it was a candidate. And if it had been closer in, protected by a glowing Jupiter as a brown dwarf star, much closer into what you would call the habitable zone, then there's no reason to not believe that at least 2 of the moons, and particularly the moon Ganymede, would have been a liquid water planet with an oxygen atmosphere. Now, that makes it, as I say, in Cosmos and Collision, it makes it spectacularly conducive to life as we know it, given those conditions. So, we just came up with the speculative idea. If we wanted to see what it would be like if you were a civilization, and you know, you probably heard of Sitchin, you know, with his Planet X and all that. Essentially, mythology is telling you that Saturn was the original Planet X, and so I don't discount that there's another brown dwarf out there that may make its approach again, or something like that, and also create cataclysms. But Saturn was that type of Planet X. It came in, it captured and disrupted the existing solar system.
Is that what people sometimes call Nibiru?
Yeah, Nibiru is another part of that. Planet X, Nibiru, this sort of thing. Sitchin got a lot of stuff wrong in his translations. Mike Heiser does a very good job on that. But effectively, what Sitchin, I'll give him credit. What Sitchin, you know, Velikovsky is the guy that everybody says he's the father of the Saturn theory and so on. But, you know, Sitchin he basically hit upon Saturn theory, but the mistake he made was he thought all the planets that we have in the solar system now were still existing when this planet Nibiru or the Planet X came through, and then disappeared back out into space again, and will come through, what is it, every 37,000 years, something like that. It was his idea. So he didn't make the connection from what he was reading in mythology with Saturn itself, which is completely understandable, because the whole of modern academia has conspired to tell us that when the ancients talk about worshiping the sun, all right, they're talking about the sun, the sun that we see in the sky today, that rises in the east and sets in the west. And they've done that because they wholeheartedly believe in the uniformitarian idea that the planet and the skies have been the same for billions of years, certainly within the experience of human beings. So the ancients bleating on about the sun up in the celestial north, this is just made up stuff. And so they've contrived to force that stuff about Saturn onto the sun that we see today. It's like taking a square peg and trying to bang it into a round hole. That's how they've done it. So when you go and learn about mythology, and Sitchin would have been in the same boat at the time, because he wasn't a language scholar or anything along those lines, but he would have had the problem of constantly being told that the Egyptians were sun worshippers, that they were all sun things. And it didn't matter that virtually every religious institution of the time built temples that were, or had sacred places that were oriented towards the north and such. The pyramid is the classic example of that, but virtually everything is oriented to the north. All the stadiums have a north entrance. Kenosis, with its labyrinth and the Minotaur story, it's all geared to the north. And when I say the north, I'm saying celestial north, not magnetic north, not geographical north. It's the celestial north. And when everybody is saying no, they were worshiping the sun. All right, it's very difficult, to make that connection. I can talk because people have gone through that process, and I've been able to pick up from people at this time, and people after me will, if this goes forward, further, they will have that advantage. But Sitchin didn't have that advantage, and so he was led down the wrong path while having the right idea that the solar system had been invaded by an interloper, a big planet that had caused all kinds of destruction, all kinds of doomsdays. It's the same story, essentially.
I recall that on script, there is a list of the names of the planets in all languages. And what is interesting there is that the Babylonian word for Jupiter was Nibiru. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, because it's the king planet. When Jesus Christ is talked about in the Bible at his birth, all right, and you've got the Star of Bethlehem, it's very easy to work out that that really what they were looking at was the confluence of the planet Jupiter in a place over the sky that would be over Bethlehem when viewed from Jerusalem. All right, so Jupiter has always been the king planet, but you see, this is for me, I'm most interested in the capture process and the breakup of the Saturnian system, and then its subsequent influence on the geopolitical, religious, economic lives of the people on the planet. There is a whole history of which I'm, probably not the best person to comment about it. I know about it and so on, but for other people like Ev Cochrane, Dave Talbot, things get really interesting after Saturn is ejected and Jupiter comes on the scene, and Mars and Venus are doing their destructive work and settling into their orbits. There's this time in history, nearly a 2,500 year epoch, in historical terms, where these planets are, how can I say, they are literally molding human endeavor, human history at that time. And Jupiter was a huge part of it. I mean, the Christian religion is largely, Jesus Christ is
Jovian, yeah.
it's Jovian, yeah. And so these sort of concepts come out of Jupiter's role, at this time. And there are people, I think, take it a bit farther. There are people who believe that they can tell you that, 10 o'clock in the morning, 2045 BC, Mars was here, doing this kind of thing while Venus was doing that. And that's why these empires fell. But Velikovsky, as we know, started the whole sort of process off with Worlds in Collision. Originally, he was writing historical reconstructions. And he realized that there was something drastically wrong with the chronologies according to the mainstream academics. And he had reached a stage where people were saying the Bible is rubbish. The Bible has no historical validity or anything like that. And being of a Jewish disposition, I don't know if he was religiously a Jew, but I think he sort of brought it upon himself that he was going to at least show that the book of his people had some historical validity. And so he sought to prove how the story of the Exodus, the 10 plagues, all the things that went on, could have happened as a result of interplanetary interactions, particularly the planet Venus swooping in at that point in time, and creating all kinds of havoc that led to the exodus of the Israelites out of slavery from Egypt. And that was really what he was. That's why he went into the cosmological side of things, because he was convinced that there was historical validity over the Exodus. But how could all these events have happened, and where are they in the historical record? In terms of what took place. And of course, what we now find is that if you take 600 years out, according to Velikovsky's scheme of things, and you shift stuff up in Egyptian, you get a perfect correlation in terms of reports of destruction and so on. And then, of course, we're finding out that Saturn theory gives a very good boost to the idea that planets had interacted with each other quite recently, historically speaking. From, I think one of the primary things that made me go down this line was the claim. You've heard of the story of the manna from heaven that the Israelites had when they were in the desert, where they got this, God sent carbohydrates basically to fall down from heaven and so on. And Velikovsky sort of surmised that the atmosphere of Venus and the atmosphere of Earth had enough interaction through whatever happened that it would have produced complex carbohydrates, and which is quite a thing to say in 1950 in terms of that. Now, it wasn't until about 1967, could be 1970, that a New Zealand scientist, totally unrelated to any of this, discovered that if you mix the gases of what we know the planet Venus to have in its atmosphere with the gases that are in the Earth's atmosphere, you get carbohydrates.
Wow.
Okay. And, so this was one of the great, sort of things that when I came to looking at Velikovsky with regards to this, this is sort of like he might be onto something here. So yes, we've got extreme historical dislocations in mainstream academia, but we also have people out there who are looking at what the planets were doing to shape history, during these periods. And it's a study that I've never gone into. Juno Cook is a very good one for that. Some of his stuff is fascinating. He's not a Eduardo Cardona fan and a fan of brown dwarf stars and so on. There's a lot of difference, has to be said. But it just basically tells us that, the skies that we see today were very different from the ancients. And, mythology, we're told by academia, it just can't be the record of witnessed natural events. And it's, this collection of, fantastical fantasies dreamed up by primitive peoples as a way of explaining unseen phenomena. What we're saying is that, that in fact, they saw completely natural phenomena, and it was interplanetary, and therefore demands that we radically alter our perception of how the solar system formed, in where it is today.
Have you ever had an encounter with somebody that says, no, there is no such thing as a solar system, the Earth is flat and no gravity and no space? And
yeah, I've been asked questions on a couple of interviews by people along those lines. Another variant of that one is the hollow Earth theory guys, and so on. I'd looked into hollow Earth quite a lot. I still actually believe the crust may be Swiss cheese to a large degree, and there's stuff within the crust that we've yet to discover, and so on. But the flat Earth stuff, I have to say, because I mean, it's become they're quite a militant lot.
Oh yeah.
The flat Earth people, they get very, very obsessed with that.
It's a religion. It's like a religion, and that it interested me for 10 minutes or so. But what I noticed very early on was, this, the type of dialogue, the discourse was, Globe-Tart and Vatican shill, Jesuit shill, and vice versa. Then it was a flat brainer, and I thought, you know what, guys, I think I pass, because that is not the way to have a discourse, and certainly yelling everybody down. And sometimes, even videos, interviews that I do that are not directly have the subject that we have now. Oh my goodness, somebody says the word planet, and you get lectured beyond belief. I think, my goodness.
Yeah. I'm quite happy in saying I don't subscribe to a flat Earth concept at all.
Me not either.
It's funny. I can't still quite think of it. It was only the other day I was thinking of a proof that goes against it. But like you say, nobody in that world is willing to listen to proofs, and experimental data, and so on. They've got their talking points, and it's a battle of talking points.
Yeah, and some of them are totally wrong, and it's junk science.
Yeah. There are so many things that just don't work for me in terms of observation. Just even stepping outside my own door, that makes no sense to me. I think the biggest thing that they can't explain to me is when I look at the constellation of Orion in New Zealand, it's upside down.
Yeah.
All right, which wouldn't happen on a flat Earth.
Yeah, exactly.
Even
night and day.
Yeah. I mean, they you've got Southern Hemisphere constellations that somebody in Germany will never see. The Southern Cross, these kinds of constellations. They're not that many, and you have the northern hemisphere, because of the Milky Way, has got this fantastic array of constellations and so on. All right. But there are some of these constellations that can be seen from both hemispheres, and Orion is the classic one. And when I came to Britain and saw Orion, even with my interest and so on, I was still taken aback. It's upside down. No, it's actually the right way up. You've been seeing it upside down, down in New Zealand. Now, a flat Earth just can't explain that. I've seen them try to do it, but they just, why would somebody? Because it's nighttime in Japan at the same time as there's nighttime in New Zealand. All right, but the Japanese see Orion differently to how I see it in New Zealand. And it just makes no sense that would be the case on a flat Earth.
Yeah. And also when you cross the equator and let's say you wash your hands, yeah, it is true. The water goes down the drain in a different direction than here.
Yeah, Coriolis effect and so on. Yeah. And that simply goes to something that modern science has had a lot of difficulty explaining, which is the whole concept of electromagnetism in space. Hannes Alfvén, Nobel Peace Prize winning physicist from Sweden, he was the guy who theorized there had to be what he called a galactic circuit, because you don't get magnetism without electricity. It's electricity that creates magnetism. In other words, a magnetized piece of metal or rock, because a lot of rocks have polarity in them. Such, and it's one of the reasons that we can tell that the Earth has undergone pole flips north to south, because the strata of rock shows different polarities that have been sort of burned into it. But you can't get that without an electrical current creating magnetism. And that's basically how, so it's a school child experiment. How do you take a nail and turn it into a magnet? You wrap a coil of copper around it, and you put the ends of the copper to the positive and negative end of the battery, hold it there, and then your nails become a magnet because it's been an electric field has passed through it. Well, that's happening to the Earth. And when Christian Birkeland, the great Norwegian scientist, did his experiments to show how the auroral activity, the northern lights and the southern lights, are caused by electrical current flowing through the Earth, everybody went, yeah, that's great. You've absolutely replicated the phenomena in the laboratory, and that, but where does the electricity come from? And they just couldn't conceive that the sun itself is part of a galactic current, and itself is feeding the electricity into the Earth as it is today. It's what determines what people running around about global warming. Yeah, Mars is warming. Mars has global warming. All the planets are warming because something is happening with their electrical connection to the sun, and Earth is no different. And this is the basis of the of electric universe. The concept of the Birkeland current conducting electricity through a galactic electrical field. And when we say galactic, we're talking, really, most humans will never conceive how big this is in terms of size. And, that power is being fed through Birkeland currents that are basically ionized plasma. It's been fed through Earth, through the sun, to create magnetism. And, it's a staple of the electric universe model.
Yeah. So, do I understand this correctly, that who is the intruder here? Was that Saturn? Was it the Sun? Who is the intruder here?
It's a kind of relativity, really. To the person on Earth, the sun was the intruder. In fact, mythology actually talks about the non-existent sun that becomes the distant sun, that then becomes the sun. As such, this brighter star than all the others, that was revealed all these stars that were revealed when Saturn lost its Langmuir sheath, its plasma bubble, on connection with the sun's heliosphere. You know, from the perspective of Earth and Saturn, that was invading us. But from the perspective of how we understand how planetary science or planetary movements work, the invader was Saturn. Saturn began life south of the sun, well outside the sun's electrical field. The electrical field of the sun being what's called the heliosphere. A lot of our probes, well, at least one of them, the Viking, the Voyager, I can't remember which one it was, they've gone through now the heliosphere, the heliopause, as they call it, and they're now out into interstellar space, as they call it. All right. And that's the thing. All these stars, all these brown dwarfs, all these rogue planets, they all have electrical fields around them as they travel through space. And when they're in interstellar space, that stabilizes. But when they come near something else with an electrical field, depending on whether that electrical field is more positive or negative to it, things happen electrically. And in this case, Saturn was a brown dwarf star encased in its own bubble, traveling north at a faster rate than the sun is traveling north. The sun travels at 57 miles a second towards the Hercules constellation northwards, towards that. Obviously, Saturn at some point accelerated once it electrically sensed, because that's what happens with electrical fields. They attract. So as soon as they start sensing, they start to speed up towards each other. Then they interact. One short circuits. And that's exactly what happened to Saturn. It started to literally comet towards the sun once it started to sense the sun's more powerful electric field. It brushed against the sun because the way I describe it, it's not coming in at a straight line from the south. It's in a very wide spiraling pattern going north. And the sun itself is also spiraling northwards. But the Saturn spiral, all right, accelerated up towards it. And that spiral didn't crash it through. It didn't pop the bubble, so to speak, and fly straight in. Its bubble brushed against the bubble of the sun, the heliosphere. And that's what triggered the great let there be light moment, the beginning of the golden age. And I believe that it then spent about 6,000 years widely orbiting the sun at a 27-degree angle, but south of the heliopause of the sun, the bubble that encompasses the sun, until it eventually was. So it kind of almost gently gets captured. It gets drawn in, it gets sucked in rather than smashing in to the heliosphere. And once it crossed that threshold, it was all over for that group of planets in the golden age. And began what I call the silver age and the post-doomsday thing, what the Bible refers to as the fall of man, the end of the Garden of Eden, and lots of other mythologies talk about this. But that's how I would characterize the approach of Saturn and its eventual capture.
Mm-hmm. So you already mentioned that a lot of what is being presented to us as, let's say, solar worship has nothing to do with the sun that we think of now. Would you say that's also true for some of the halos that you see on depictions? And sometimes these days, especially politicians are photographed in a way where they often have a halo around them.
That's Saturn Death Cult stuff, whether people like it or not. That's the rings of Saturn. Okay. That's the golden rings of Saturn that because the rings were illuminated by the sun, all right, okay, the body of Saturn, though it glowed, all right, so if you look at Saturn today, from south, you'll look up, you'll see one side of Saturn illuminated by the sun, if you're looking from below up, and you'll see the other side is dark, all right? And you will also, depending on where its orbit is, you will see the rings, because it's on a 27 degree, roughly a 27 degree tilt, you will see the rings illuminated by the sun, but you'll also see the shadow of Saturn cast across the rings behind Saturn on the other side of the sun. All right, it's quite a spectacular, look about it and so on. It's something that you can only see from below, and yet this is often, what I argue in my book, that the symbolism actually shows that concept of the rings being partially hidden by the shadow of Saturn. Now, when Saturn was glowing, of course, there is no hemisphere in light and hemisphere in darkness. It didn't have a night side. It was a glowing object. It's like shining a torch onto the bulb, the bulb of the light. It's not going to make an impression. You're not going to stick your finger between it and see a shadow on the light bulb. It just isn't going to happen because it's casting out its own light. But the rings of Saturn never cast out its own light, and they were illuminated by the sun. And if you consider that the body of Saturn becomes the face of the god Saturn, all right, and that interacts with Venus, its 8-pointed star, and so on like that, then the rings of Saturn become that classic halo, especially on the night side of Earth. When you look up to Saturn in the night sky during this time when it was in the celestial north, you will see effectively the exactly that concept of a halo. The daytime side. You'll see you'll see the rings illuminated above Saturn's face, and so on. And of course, the rings, the way the light played on it, it looked like they rotated around Saturn regularly, which is what gave us our first idea of the passage of time, taking place along with the way that the stars moved about us, which we'd never seen before in the Purple Dawn era, and that's humanity had never seen it. But the halo effect, was, it's the most godly aspect of Saturn's claim to be God. The rings become his scythe as well. It becomes the famous boat of night that the Egyptians talk about, because it looks like a boat, undercarriage and so on like that. And this is where a lot of those symbols definitely come through. And when you see world leaders position themselves, particularly American leaders, all right, with and European leaders as well now, with their 12 stars, in a circle and so on like that. This is about as Saturn Death Cult like in terms of culture as you can get. And in my opinion, it becomes, if it weren't so serious, if these people weren't as powerful as they are and so effective, it's comical. Yeah. They would try to cloak themselves in the same thing as a sort of spectacular night vision that people had of natural events 6,000 years ago.
Yeah. So,
all right.
So do we really know, or do we have estimates when all of that happened?
In the latest edition of my book, Saturn Death Cult, a lot of people ask this, so I put a chronology at the end of the book to give people an idea of what I think the basic time frames are and so on. But basically speaking, Saturn goes nova about 12,000 years ago.
Okay.
Then the golden age lasts for what I think is possibly around about 6,000 years. At the end of that 6,000 year period, Saturn is fully captured by the sun, and the breakup takes place. And basically you get the cataclysms of mythology that you hear about, whether it's the biblical account of the fall of Eden or Atlantis or this, a lot of it's flood oriented and so on. And so that sort of equates to about 4,000 BC, which in biblical terms, if people want to use that as a reference, that is the fall of Adam and Eve, and the birth of Cain and Abel, and the mortality of man. So at 4000 BC, we go through a process which lasts about 2,500 years, whereby the solar system that we know today undergoes a process of rearranging itself into the configuration that we see today. And that really probably comes to an end about 500 BC at the very latest. I would favor a little bit earlier than that. So really, the skies that we've seen today, which are remarkably stable, if mythology is anything to go by, they've only been stable for 2,500 to 3,000 years, which is a blink of an eye, really, in terms of things. But we're very lucky in that sense, and so that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that we went from recording what were planetary disasters, and now we undergo man-made disasters, disasters that are essentially the result of greed, scarcity, and a desire to have control over one's fellow, humans, that seems to have infected a proportion of our population down through the years. I would put the blame at people like Plato, the sophists, these kinds of people, creating certain types of thinking that has led to the idea that mankind can be his own god, can be the humankind, I should say, in this day and age, will determine for itself its own destiny, rather than God himself would be determining. That's the major train of thought that was changed with people like Plato and the sophists, and which has largely been picked up by the occultists. So this this deep-seated desire to return to the paradise of the golden age before doomsday has been taken up by a lot of occult thinkers on the basis that they are moving towards it through the process of technology, or the creation of technology, and they will create their own golden age, like Saturn created the original golden age, and they will rule like Saturn, the children of Saturn and his heirs.
Does that go hand in hand with the wish to reignite Saturn?
I don't know. It's possible. Their problem with that is that a lot of these people who are part of what I call this Saturn Death Cult, occult culture, are themselves victims of believing modern science. The concepts that we have today are science. Now, in modern science, they believe in the accretion method of planetary formation. And so they believe that stars are bodies that get so heavy with gravity, they start to implode on themselves, thus triggering a controlled nuclear reaction that then bursts forth into light. And so in the same way that an atomic bomb is used to set off a hydrogen bomb by creating an acceleration of electrons and factors involved in that, they believe that they can do the same thing to planets or to dead stars, that they could ignite them in that way. I say good luck with that. You're not going to do that with a nuclear explosion, because these objects are not controlled in the way that they believe they are controlled. I believe that when I say believe, it's the electric universe model that looks on all these celestial bodies as electrostatic phenomenon and so on. And of course, this goes back to the debate between electric universe and the mainstream science, which is that mainstream science believes in a gravity only. Everything is controlled by mass,
Mm.
by physical force. And of course, when they look out into the observable universe, they only find they've got less than 5% of the actual mass needed to explain how everything is held together if gravity is the only force in the universe. The electric universe says, yeah, that's because you're not seeing the other 95% in the form of plasma, and particularly plasma that, the plasma that conducts electricity. And that's what's holding the whole universe together. It's the power of electromagnetism combined with elements where mass and gravity is very, very small part of the equation. Mm. So the idea of trying to ignite a planet is they're just not going to succeed. They're going to have a shock like they did when they landed probes on comets, and they found that in fact those comets are not fluffy snowballs like they believe. They're incredibly hard rock, and so on. In the electric universe, again, we're the opposite. We believe a lot of the comets that you see are actually the result of recent planetary cataclysms. They're the debris, the flying, the stuff that's been machined off electrically off planets like Mars. It's a whole northern hemisphere. I think it's about 5 miles deeper, if you know what I mean, than the southern hemisphere. Mars is like 2 bowls put together, one on top of the other, but the top bowl is smaller. Where stuff is flying off. And of course, we keep finding stuff from Mars here on Earth and such. How did this happen? Electric universe proponents say that, these cataclysms ejected this material out into space. Mars was particularly hit hard. And so comets are very recent. And mainstream science tries to tell us that comets are actually the oldest part of our solar system. So there's huge disconnects between these two, trains of thought. And if you're invested in one, you're never, ever going to move over to the other one, particularly those whose job it is to back up the system, the paradigm of modern science and so on. But I'd have to say that I learned early on that for people who want to understand how the electric universe and the things that I'm saying about Saturn becoming being a brown dwarf star that's captured, it all starts with understanding how the electric universe explains comets. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, comets are these bodies that hurtle into our solar system, and at some point they develop tails. And modern science is telling you that the fluffy snowball is sublimating the moisture, because in a vacuum, water that is ice doesn't warm up and become liquid. There's no atmosphere to hold it. It becomes steam. So those big, giant, massive comets tails that you see, some of them, stretch the distance that there is between planets. They're truly huge ones. That's supposedly water vapor reflecting the sun, sun's light back at us, and it's caused by the heat of the sun pressurizing these comets. What the electric universe proposes instead is that a comet is a body with its own electrical field, and when it enters into the sun's electrical field, all right, it develops a reaction that is a Langmuir sheath that starts to glow, because in plasma it is dark mode, there's glow mode, and there's arc mode, and the process by which plasma works is that when it's excited, it starts to glow, and when it gets really excited, it starts to arc or flare. And at that particular point, when the comet enters into the sun's much more powerful electrical field, it starts to glow and even arc. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing a comet tail, which is effectively plasma glowing in terms of the electrical interaction. And once somebody understands that element of the electric universe, that's what's going on, then it becomes, you just extrapolate it to captured planets, events taking place that mythology tells us. Really, it just sounds like what we know, how we understand plasma and how it reacts. And it's not a coincidence that some of the best people in the electric universe model now who are working there are top-notch people from the world of plasma research. Guys like Anthony Peratt and so on. These guys know how plasma works, and they're able to see in rock pictographs, pictures, all these funny designs that you get carved on rocks, whatever the culture is. To them, it just looks like plasma they've seen in the laboratory.
I have to say, Saturn has always been a little bit of a puzzler for me. So on the one hand, we have this association with the Golden Age. And then we have depictions where Saturn rips out pieces of flesh from his children. And I think it's called Saturn is devouring his children.
Yeah.
So
he's a killer.
Yeah. Okay, you could argue with that devouring, Kronos, time is grinding you down, and but still, there is a very, very violent aspect to that. And then combined with the Golden Age, I'm really confused.
Well, it gets worse. You see, in Saturn Death Cult culture, when you get into the more serious occult stuff, you start understanding that there is a tradition of cannibalism, child sacrifice, that sort of stuff. You also understand they have an absolute fascination with divination, which is telling the future. And a lot of that was done through things like reading entrails. And of course, we have through ancient times, people would read the entrails of chickens or goats or whatever it is, but the best entrails was sacrificing a human and having a read of their entrails and so on like that. Now, what that comes about is that the observation of Saturn undergoing extreme electrical stress, the planet Saturn at the beginning, it literally bursts out into light, a good thing, changes the world. At the time, it must have been shocking, but it changes the world, and it creates a very a very satisfying environment for humans to live in terms of access to things like food, perpetual harvests, that kind of stuff. All right. But the planet itself seems to be undergoing a struggle. And one of the struggles that it's undergoing is that it ejects all this black material out with its water as well. The water will ultimately form the rings, the famous rings of Saturn. But the black material, before the rings even form, is this like snake-like monster, the serpent, feathered serpent, what it comes into. But also a lot of people read it as Saturn's entrails. All right. And Saturn overcomes this material that seems to want to blot Saturn out at one point. And this stuff dissipates over time, and it's just read as Saturn overcoming the chaos monster. And as a result of that, a lot of ritual was centered around the idea of, mimicking what they saw in the abode of the gods. So the circumambulatory rituals that you often see, particularly in Mesoamerica and North America, tribal, but Africa has it, Asia has it. There's even elements, Stonehenge, these sorts of things in European culture. This idea of a ritual that is a circle that goes around in a clockwise form around a central object. Now, the most famous example of that is the Islamic Hajj, where they do 7 circles around the stone, black stone at Mecca, and so on. So this idea of circular rituals and such, and what the battle that it represents, Saturn overcoming this monster that wants to blot out this life-giving light and so on. This is the origins of what these rituals come from, and of course divination becomes one of the most important aspects about taking these rituals. Can it tell you how the god Saturn is going to behave in the future? What will he do? What can we see might be on the horizon in terms of our experience with this? Now, there are also other bodies. Some would call them titans and things like that, but these are the moons of Saturn. Saturn has 67 moons that we know of at this point in time. Some of them quite large. Titan's a big moon, and very interestingly, it may actually be its closest cousin may be Venus, because as I was saying before, Venus is an injected part of the Saturn body, becoming its own planet. But there are all these little wee moons, and in the process of defeating the chaos monster and the creating of the rings and so on, we see 67 moons with our probes today. We didn't know Saturn had moons until the space age and so on like that. But the ancients seem to believe that that Saturn was absolutely inundated with them, and he started killing them. All right. So what they were really seeing is they were seeing destructive episodes taking place with orbiting bodies around Saturn being eaten up and so on along those lines. And when you look at the myths, particularly with regards to Zeus or Jupiter, who is the son of Kronos, Saturn, what connects Earth to Saturn and the abode of the gods is this stairway, this tree of life, this electrical current that glows and arcs sometimes. And it has lots of different tendrils and filamentary features to it. And people noticed that there was another body on the end of one of these filamentary things, these what we know to be currents. And of course, that is the electrical connection between the now approaching planet Jupiter and Saturn, who are going to come into conflict. And at the end of the Golden Age, as Jupiter approaches, Saturn starts to get sick. It's seen to be eating up all these orbiting bodies and so on, but at the same time, it's under pressure where the configuration of planets is starting to break apart. And which something we haven't discussed, at some point, the Earth and the system come into contact with the rest of the water that Saturn had expelled out at the beginning of the Golden Age. And that's what causes the great flooding on Earth. That brings up the deluge, the loss of Atlantis, all this sort of stuff, the doomsday event. And at the end of the doomsday event, you see the entire polar configuration that looked like a giant eyeball in the sky with, Mars in the middle and, as the pupil, and Venus as the iris, and Saturn as the main part of the eye. That's just broken apart at this particular point in time. And as a result of that doomsday and the cataclysms on the Earth, Saturn gets a reputation for being capricious. Sort of like, why would he do this to us? Why would this happen? What have we done wrong here? And such, all right? And it's that capricious nature that is observed by people on Earth that leads into the idea of might is right, the sophist idea that if you've got the power, it's not about justice, it's entirely about influence, with whichever power is the strongest and such. And so that way of thinking goes away from a justice-oriented golden age into an age where Saturn can turn on you, even though he feeds you, prosperity, health, all that sort of stuff. He can also turn on you, and he can turn on you in the way that other planets are let loose to come and destroy you and so on along those lines. In other words, it's all down to Saturn.
This
such.
Unpredictable behavior that you just described, was that one of the reasons that led to, let's say, the deification of planets?
Well, the deification plans happened prior to that.
Okay.
All right. So the Golden Age established the planets as gods. That's what Plato tells us. There's a train of thought that says Saturn theory is rubbish, and what people are saying about that, like myself, are saying is rubbish because the ancients never identified their gods with the planets. That was something that was put on later. All right. Okay. Saturn right out there, the thing they said was the great god, and that we decided to call that little pinprick on the of light on the edge of the thing, that's Saturn. I mean, it would have made more sense if it had been the sun in terms of how these people think. But that argument is spurious. It is a fact that the ancients identified the gods as stars, and that the planets were always seen as stars. And that's why the star within the crescent is possibly the ultimate Saturnian symbol, which is something you never see in our skies. There's no such thing as seeing a star inside a crescent. Yet it's a part of Islam. It's part of the ancient world. It's along those lines, and it can only be described by a polar configuration of planets, where one of the planets has a ring that is half illuminated to create a crescent, and one of the planets is flaring like an 8-pointed star. This is the only thing that could, because and as I say, just jump to the next conclusion. They're telling you that 8-pointed star creating the star-like thing, along with is Venus and Saturn, and they're telling you that the crescent is the scythe of Saturn, the boat of heaven. It's totally related to Saturn, that these were planets, or what they called stars. So a lot of people have made the mistake of thinking that the crescent we see in ancient cultures is moon worship. All right, they've got this idea it's moon worship, but has anybody ever seen a bright star nestled into a half moon or a quarter moon? It just doesn't happen. And so where did that symbolism come from? And why do the ancients insist that these things are planets and stars, that the stars that they venerated were also the planets? So, and again, it becomes ridiculous to say that it was a later conferring of the name onto the planets, because in Mesoamerican culture, in African culture, in Chinese culture, they seem to have put the same archetype on the same planet, which is an impossibility that it would be the same all around the world. That the Chinese would point at Saturn, that the Vedic Indians would point at Saturn, Mesoamericans would point at Saturn, and confer the same archetypes, the Saturn archetypes, on that particular planet, and refer to it as the same name as their god. You would expect maybe the Mesoamericans would point at the sun, and the Indians might point at the moon, and you would have different things like that. But the fact that worldwide comparative mythology shows that each planet has the same archetypes applied to it across the board. So the Saturn archetype is always linked to the planet Saturn. The Venus archetype is always linked to the planet Venus. The warrior archetype is always linked to the planet Mars. And so logically that doesn't hold true if in fact it was a later application of the name onto the planets.
So the ancients knew these are celestial objects?
Totally. That's the whole thesis of my argument, is that when you understand,
And why then the deification? I don't get it.
Okay, deification. All right. The idea that deification, so some sort of spiritual thing. Okay. What I argue in Saturn Death Cult is that what Saturn is venerated for is that by bringing light to the earth, when it had gone through a time of darkness, it allowed humans to develop the concept of weights and measures. And weights and measures, all right, is what creates civilization. And ultimately, by having accurate weights and measures, it creates a thing called justice. And when humans are interacting with each other under these new conditions with weights and measures that create the laws by which they can create contracts to, I'll see you next Tuesday and you will build this much in this time, and we can measure it because Saturn, that planet up there, has given us this new environment. Then the environment created by Saturn's nova-like activity is what is venerated. All right. In other words, it's seen as a gift to humanity that they did not create of their own will. It took Saturn to blow up nova-like, that let there be light moment, the beginning of the Christian narrative, the biblical narrative, but also in all the other religions. It's that moment where Saturn hadn't done that, we'd still be animals wandering around in the darkness that that makes life very brutal, short, and so on. Saturn gifted us the ability to read time, to calculate time, and thereby create a whole lot of measures. And as a result of that, we can interact with each other and settle our disputes without resorting to violence if we apply that. That's what's venerated originally. All right.
I understand that, but then we have stories about the gods fathering children here. There is, treason and war and adultery and what have you. Yeah, everything that you are seeing, among humans as well. So, if
well, it certainly has been taken up by humans to follow what they think are psychodramas. But again, I argue, all right, that a lot of what we read as mythology today have narratives that have been imposed on the mythological record to reflect what they believe to be fantastical psychodramas. All right. They don't look at it as natural phenomena being explained or recorded. They look on it as, well, this must be some kind of psychodrama. And then because of the legacy of what Saturn brought in terms of these weights, measures, rule of law, all that sort of stuff, these psychodramas become infused with that power, the power to measure, the power to say what is right, what is wrong. And it just becomes a mess. Mythology in its original form, if you're looking for a human narrative, it's not there. But many authors, particularly in the modern age, it's become absolutely terrible. They'll take it and they say, and they literally, how can I rewrite this as a Tom Clancy novel? How can I rewrite mythology as as an epic to make into a TV show that the Game of Thrones or something like that? Okay, that's what they've done to mythology in the last 200 years. If you read it in its purest sense, it's meaningless in terms of human narrative. But if you read it with the idea that it is a record, literally a warning to us, this is what happens in the skies, this is what we went through, and so on, all right, then it starts to make sense. But in so doing, you've got to find some kind of scientific paradigm that explains how that could have happened. And mainstream cosmology, the modern scientific way of looking at things, will tell you, no, that's rubbish. You couldn't have planets flying about and in polar configurations and brown dwarfs being captured by the sun. And hell no, it didn't. There's no way that happened during human memory. All right. So that's the world we live in at the moment. But the book I write, I hope that people, I don't expect people to go, yeah, that's exactly true now. What I want them to do is to explore this as a research, to go and look for evidence to see mythology in a completely different light to the latest Hollywood movie, Clash of the Titans, or something,
So to slowly wrap this up, the arrival of human sacrifice. And I think that's never left us, really. Yeah. Never, ever. And why did that happen? Why did people all of a sudden think you have to sacrifice humans?
because mythology in its original form told us that Saturn started doing exactly that, started eating up his own progeny, which were planetary bodies, planetary moons, orbiting objects. And because the king planet that ruled the skies for a short time after Saturn, was the main body in the sky other than the sun, Jupiter, seemed to, which is the other side of human sacrifice, regicide, the killing of the patriarch by the son, so he can take the mother. That's pure Freudian sort of thinking in terms of that side of things. But that misunderstanding of mythology again is when you've got people who are intent on one thing only, and that is to dominate their fellow humans to their own benefit. All right, it comes back to what I was saying in our last interview, the classic biblical statement: by the sweat of your own brow you make the earth yield its fruits. In the golden age, you didn't have to sweat. You didn't have to worry where food was going to come from. It was there. Everything was in a permanent state of fruiting throughout the world. Once that changed, all right, as I said in the last interview, there were people who didn't want to sweat to make the earth yields its fruits. They would prefer that everybody else sweated for them. All right, so they had to find ways in order to convince people they had the authority to make people do the sweaty things to make life good. Now, I've said this many times. You can do it the obvious way, and that is be the tough guy who threatens to beat up anyone who doesn't go out and farm. But, when you've got 100 guys under you, at some point you've got too many people to hold and control. You can't maintain control by fear in that way. So the way to maintain control is to find mechanisms where the vast majority of people believe you have some kind of authority bestowed on you. And so appealing back to the golden age when things were great and saying, we all want to get back to that. And the only way we're going to get back to that is if you do what I tell you, because I've got the secrets from back then. All right. If I have those secrets and I have control over that, you have to come to me and I'll tell you what to do. And by the way, when I tell you what to do, it's always going to benefit me. Now, ultimately, that boils down, that form of control over people, I argue in my book, is refined into a point when the measure of work done, of your productivity, the price of your work, the thing we call money, comes under their control, where they can coin it and make it a debt and such, to you, so that you go out to do your work using their money, but you're already, right from that moment, you're in debt to them. And that debt gives them access and to foreclose on you, and it creates division between people. They can pay people to, if you get uppity about something, they can pay people to do you over, and vice versa. We go down that route where now you've got an elite that is saying, look, we're trying to do it for your own good. We've seen this in today's world with this pandemic. This is for your own good. Do what you're told. Do what, do what it says. We have the authority to do that. And that starts near the end of what I call the Silver Age, when the priests the priesthood start off. We've got to somehow rebuild the world and use what we learned in the Golden Age to make this age habitable and good for people. But there's going to be that small psychopathic element that goes, yeah, what's good for us is that you will do the work for me. And this gives me control mechanisms taken from that golden age. And you look at me as somebody who has access to that knowledge, and you don't have that knowledge. So you better do what I say, because I've got the knowledge. And that's what powers the occult. It's what, and of course, the fear symbols of, human sacrifice, you want to pull it all the way back to that. Part of saying I'm part of this Saturn heritage is I do what Saturn did. I kill my children. I, do all these kinds of different things that are associated with Saturn, and even Jupiter for that matter. And ultimately, it comes down to the capriciousness of Saturn where, maybe the world saw, what did we do wrong at the end of the Golden Age? Why did everything get destroyed in a moment? And that, well, the people that have Saturn's authority, they hold over us, will be like that as well. We can turn on you and destroy you in a second, and that's what creator king like gods do. All right. And all the rituals, all of the religions have all developed aspects of this to promote that message that an elite few have access to that knowledge and should rule over us for our own benefit. And it went horribly wrong at the end of the Silver Age, was institutionalized during what's the Heroic or Bronze Age. And now we're into the Iron Age, which is typified by the idea that we're all in it for ourselves. And it's not a matter of justice for our fellow human beings. It's a matter of being the most influential so that, we do less sweat than the other guys in making the earth yield its fruits.
Yeah, that has been a very successful model for a handful of people. And
they've been perpetuating it since the days of Babylon. It's been perpetuated. They're trying one right now. This idea of crashing a system and resetting it. As old as the Tower of Babel. It's been done over and over and over, through the ages. Things are not as bad as I thought they would be. I mean, I think the worst crash that they ever perpetuated was the time of the Black Death, the 1340s in Europe, but really worldwide. China suffered badly under that as well. And so on, not so much the New World, but it seems like things happened in the Mayan civilization as well at that time. But the Black Death period, 1340s in Europe, was about as close to hell on earth as I think anybody could have ever gone through on this planet. The Justinian plague was pretty bad in the 600s. But, this is their model. They start a war, they create an economic crash, which impinges abilities of people to feed themselves. Their immune systems go down, in comes a plague, and they come in as the saviors. Hey, we're going to start a new world order. And this is our new way of, enslaving you through debt, and everybody goes, thank God for that, but I don't think that's going to happen this time.
Yeah, no. It's
too many conversations like this going on.
Yeah, it's so destructive.
Yeah.
And I think in general, this entire anti-life agenda is becoming more and more obvious if you pay attention.
I'm very optimistic that they've overplayed their hand, and I honestly do believe it occurred to me, and I've heard people say it, that today's supervillains or today's Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, the people that run the shows, are not your grandfathers. Today's Rothschilds are not your great grandfather's Rothschilds.
No.
Those Rothschilds back then were clever people. They knew what they were doing. Today's bunch, are really
generated.
To be desired in terms of intellectual capacity. So I think that's why the failure is taking place. It may be just simply they've inbred far too much down through the ages, and even the fresh blood is now not doing it. But then I also like to think that there might be something that, whether it is what people might call the universe, the morphic field of nature, that has realized that this stuff needs to be stopped. Some people would point to a true God, a God of justice, exerting himself finally as a way of saying, well, this is how, it's basically a Christian concept. God gives you your hand, or gives you the length of rope to hang yourself, so that you understand that you can't do things without, and I always say it's not without God ruling as a king. It's the idea that you were given a set of laws and measures that make sense, Now apply them properly. I don't think anybody can argue that, you know, murder is a wrong thing.
Yeah.
You know, nobody can argue that rape is a wrong thing, that kidnapping is a wrong thing, that child molestation is a wrong thing. All right. And nobody should be able to argue against the idea that onerous debt, saying to somebody, I'm going to give you something and I'm giving you 10 of them, and there are only 10 of them, but you've got to give me 11 back. And if you don't, I'm going to take everything you own, and I'm going to own your family and your, you know, your children. They're going to be my slaves. All right. Nobody can say these things are not, you know, are not wrong. Only the people who want to benefit from that promote that kind of behavior. And at some point, there's a tipping point against that kind of thinking. We all just get sick of it. And it happens every now and then in history. And I think we're at one of those points.
Yeah. So would you like to add something that I might have forgotten, what you find important to mention?
Well, we've discussed pretty much the cosmology. You know, for people who want to get a better handle of it, really read the book. And it's very difficult to encapsulate something like this in even a 5-hour interview. You know, the book is probably the best way to get an idea on that, and use the book as a way of directing yourself to future research. You know, the hardcore scientists that might be involved in this kind of stuff. It's meant to point you in that direction. So that's what the book exists for. It gives you pictorial ideas so that you can get your head around concepts that seem so at odds with what we've been taught over the over the decades. But you know, use the book that way, and you know, keep an open mind and see where that goes, and follow your own thoughts.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure. I'm pretty sure we will talk again. And yeah, guys, that was it. Night Flight for today. And we will see you all next week, and stay safe and sound out there. Bye-bye.